looking at you because they have the headphones on. Okay, good.
Thank you. All right, you guys can hear us, right? Good? Thumbs up? Louder? I got to get down here? All right. Hold on, let me... Yeah, you want to... I mean, he's shorter than me, though, so we got a middle ground. Yeah, okay.
This is actually good.
This is good for you, too? Okay. So our talk is the payphone you have dialed has been disconnected, the state and revival of payphones in 2023. So a little agenda. So we're going to talk about who we are. We're going to talk about what's a payphone for some of you who might not have ever seen or used a payphone. We'll talk about how an interest in networking infrastructure kind of led to mapping and scanning payphones across the country. And we'll introduce the PhilTel project, which is a payphone project we both work on. We'll talk about PhreakNet, which is a cool hobbyist phone collectors network and how that ties into PhilTel. And then we'll wrap it up with our future plans. So I'm Mike. I'm a professional software engineer. I mostly work on UI stuff, which is totally different than anything you're going to be seeing in this. I've been at the Philly 2600 meetings since 2012, so probably the last, 11 years. I've been going to these hacker meetups every month. I've been a free PBX and Asterisk user since 2012 as well. So as soon as the Raspberry Pi came out, I put a phone system on it and connected up a bunch of vintage phones, and I kind of never shook that hobby. I've always kind of kept up with that. I started a project in 2018 called Networks of Philly, which serves to sort of map local networking infrastructure within Philadelphia. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And I founded a hobbyist dial-up ISP in 2021. So you can take your old computer, plug in the modem, and dial up free of charge and browse the web over dial-up like the internet should be experienced. Yeah.
Hey everyone, I'm Naveen. Actually also just founded a dial-up ISP like a couple weeks ago, so we're both there now. Studied computer engineering over at Penn, worked in IT for a couple years, got into the telephone hobby through telephone collecting in around 2016 or so. Really enjoyed hooking old phones up to PBXs and seeing what kinds of things I could do. Started experimenting with Asterisk and really enjoyed that. So I've been working with that ever since. Started getting interested in payphones specifically around 2019 or so. We'll talk more about that later. And then more recently, I've also been working on my own BBS package for any fellow BBS sysops out there. So this whole time I've also been an environmental activist, so that's something that I like to meld into all of this. So thinking about or trying to support people that might be coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, like people that might not have broadband access, trying to get them telephony and computer resources that can help them out, as well as thinking about the environmental footprint of communications and computer technologies. So things like planned obsolescence. So that's a theme that you'll see throughout the presentation today.
Oops. So what is a payphone? If you have never experienced a payphone, there used to be these giant phones in these sort of metal obelisks just on the street corners in the back of like a 7-Eleven or in like a train station. And before cell phones were really widespread, if you wanted to make a call to somebody, you had to track one of these down, hope that you had pocket change. You might have to wait in line, and you go up, you key in the number, you make your call. So this is a picture actually from New York City in, I think, the early 2000s. And I don't think this was any special day, like no national emergency. This is just people using the phone on any given Tuesday. So we used to see this a lot. This used to be how you contact people when you're out and about and not at home. But nowadays, you really don't see this anymore. If you even find a payphone locally, it probably doesn't work. You might just even ignore it. So it occurred to me that we have like a whole generation growing up that has never used a payphone, maybe has never seen a payphone. And it's interesting to think that the way that the younger generation probably knows about them is through movies. So here's just a bunch of screenshots from movies, and it's interesting to think that payphones were once used as like a plot point. So you can't get a hold of somebody, or the murderer's at the payphone and they're trying to trace the call so they can go find him, and they get there and the handset's off the hook dangling. They just missed him. So it's interesting to kind of think about all of these scenarios that now could be totally avoided with cell phones. So what is a payphone? This is probably what you think of if you have an image in your mind of a payphone. So on the left there is an older style 3-slot rotary dial payphone. These were mostly phased out in the late 70s, I believe, to make way for the Fortress style phones that you'll see in the center and the right side of the screen. So in the center, that's a Western Electric model, and you can tell that because the coin slot is on the left side, where the right image is a GTE model that has the coin slot on the right. So this is to say that you would have a 3-slot payphone typically seen with a rotary dial. They made 3 slots with a keypad. They made these Fortress style phones that had a rotary dial. So there's a lot of different kinds of payphones. You might walk by a payphone and not even realize it's a payphone because of how it's styled. But this is generally what we're talking about when we're going to be referencing payphones, something that looks like this. So I mentioned earlier I had started this project called Networks of Philly, and I was attempting to discover and understand network infrastructure around us. So really this just meant that you could find me wandering Center City, staring at manhole covers and street markings and trying to make sense of them and figure out what cables were going underneath our feet all day, what communications were being transported in this completely sort of unseen world. So one thing that really kind of happened out of this is that Naveen and I got connected through this project actually because I had been looking up old phone central office buildings and trying to map those. So Naveen by himself was sort of doing the same thing. And we got to talking, we talked about different buildings, but also we thought, hey, what payphones are there still out there? And about this time, I know Naveen was starting to collect payphone numbers. So while I was out looking around, I started going up to payphones, seeing if they worked, trying to find remaining ones that you could still use. So to talk about payphones in the city, we sort of have to backtrack a bit and talk about the local telephone infrastructure. So Bell of Pennsylvania came to Philadelphia in, I believe it was 1879, I always mix those up. So they operated pretty much unopposed until 1900 when the Keystone telephone system came to town, which is kind of crazy to think that 20 some years after Bell, the official Bell that's all over the country, set up shop, a rival telephone company came around. But Keystone really positioned themselves as a business telephone company. So they said when the Keystone rings, it's business. So you would have businesses that would have a Keystone line for business communications and a Bell line for residential calls. So if you're like a local shop, you might want the people living nearby to call in to ask something, but also you needed a line for business-to-business communication. So yeah, they would say, oh, I'm going to call you on the Keystone later. They had their own slang, and they offered the fastest dialing in Philadelphia because they only had 5-digit numbers. So interesting selling point. So they actually lasted a little while. In the 1940s, they ended up being bought by Bell. And then we basically had Bell of Pennsylvania here until 1984, when the government broke up Ma Bell into 7 Baby Bell companies. So out of that, we got Bell Atlantic, and then eventually Bell Atlantic merged with GTE to form Verizon in 2000. So Verizon exited the payphone business in 2012, and they sold most of their payphone assets to this company called PTS, Pacific Telemanagement Services. So PTS was pretty much the main payphone operator within Philadelphia. I think last year, people were asking me how many payphones were active in Philly, and it was probably about 100, which was down 50 from the year before, so there was 150, then 100. Right now, there's like a handful of them that are still working under PTS. So as the years have gone by, in the past 2-year period, we've gone to very few payphones that are actually operating in Philadelphia total.
Yeah, so as Mike mentioned, a few years back, we really became interested in trying to figure out where all the working payphones that we could find were. And something that I had been doing at the time was whenever I encountered a payphone, I would note down the number and where it was, maybe take some pictures, and eventually I started mapping them all out into what you see here. And as you can see, a lot of payphones mostly are clustered on the two coasts. So places like the Bay Area today actually still have a lot of payphones. And then you also have pockets of payphones sprinkled throughout New England and in places in between as well. This is another map of Philadelphia actually showing payphones in the city specifically. This is maintained by another payphone enthusiast here in Philadelphia actually. And as you can see, most of the working payphones that are left, so those are denoted in blue. The red ones are former payphones that aren't there or don't work anymore. Most of the working payphones that are left are mostly in the downtown area, with a few exceptions. But over time, that has pretty much continued to shrink inward to just the downtown area for the most part. So here are a few noteworthy locations in Philadelphia that you might have actually seen or been a lot of times without realizing it. So first, in the upper left, we have at 30th Street Station. So this is the big ramp between the lower part and the regional rail part of the station. If you've been up there, there's this big empty ramp, and it used to actually be full of payphones. So if you look carefully at this picture, you can kind of see the imprint of where there used to be payphones on that ramp. And so there were just banks of payphones here. And in, I think, the early 2010s, these were all removed. So in the upper right corner, that is, or was actually the last working payphone at 30th Street Station here in the city. It was removed. Amtrak ordered it removed just last year in October, I believe. So that was in the south part of the station, kind of hidden away, but still getting a lot of usage. Pretty much every time I was there using the payphone, there was a line of people behind me. So in the lower left corner, that is the payphone just south of City Hall, right here on Broad Street, actually. So if you go just south of City Hall near the subway, that is the phone there. Also pretty heavily used. In the middle bottom here, we have a couple of the payphones at Suburban Station. So that's actually a unique location because it's one of the few places where you have multiple working payphones next to each other, which used to be a very common sight, but today is getting exceedingly rare to find something like that. And then finally, in the lower right, that is the payphone at the 11th Street subway station here in the city. So SEPTA does maintain a number of phones like that, but they're kind of hidden away in just a few key stations. So as I began mapping out these payphones, eventually I had the idea of calling a payphone and seeing what would happen if I did that. And in and of itself, it's not a really strange idea. So back in the day, if you called a payphone, it would basically just ring. And maybe if somebody was there, they could even answer. So a lot of payphones have ringers inside them, actually, just like regular phones. So if you were to call the payphone and somebody was there, you could answer. So you might see this in movies a lot, for example, from the time. But these days, it's a little bit different. So back then, most payphones were what were called dumb phones, or dumb payphones, basically, where they required special coin lines from the phone company to operate. So there would be high voltage, I guess for a phone line, high voltage, collect and return voltage, and other control signals for controlling the payphone. And the payphone itself didn't really have any smarts. It didn't do any of the cost rating or any of that. It was a much simpler device. But these days, you're more likely to find what's called a COCOT, a customer-owned, coin-operated telephone. And these are smartphones where they have processing boards inside the phones themselves that determine how much a call is going to cost. They do all of the billing, and they can work just on regular phone lines. So you don't need a special coin line or anything like that. And these phones typically have modems in them as well. And these modems are used for remote management. So if you're a big payphone provider and you need to monitor all of your payphones out in the field, a modem is kind of a sensible way to do that because the phones are already plugged into a phone line, so you can call them. And so these have 300 or 1200 baud modems in there, and the payphone provider can use that to monitor how busy certain phones are, when phones might be getting full, and they might need to send somebody out to collect the revenue. If there's an issue with the phone, they might get notified that way. So those are the typical functions of that, basically for the payphone provider. So you might be wondering, how secure is this remote management functionality? And the answer is the security is basically non-existent. So this is actually a printout I obtained at one point from a phone. So if you call these phones and you have the right kind of modem and the phone is programmed to answer, then typically you might get a printout like this. So this is for ProTel board specifically, which is a very common type of board that's inside COCOTs in the US today. And I'll just briefly go through the different components of this. So the first bit there is the 10-digit number of the payphone itself. And this is typically just the number that you would dial of the phone, but occasionally it can be different due to typically a number change or something like that. And then way at the end is the relative amount of money that was in the coin box when it was last emptied. And I say relative because you have to do a little bit of math. If you take the second number actually and you subtract that last value, then you'll get how much money is currently in the coin vault in the payphone. The next one is the model number. So as I mentioned, these boards have firmware on them, and that firmware can often be upgraded. So the 8822 is probably the most common type of firmware that I see, but occasionally you do see the older 7000 series of firmware as well. And then these next 4 digits, I'm actually not 100% sure about that. I've talked with some other payphone collectors and people that know about this kind of stuff, and we're not sure if it's a checksum or some kind of pin. What I have noticed is that this only changes when the coin vault is emptied, but not every time that the coin vault is emptied. So it's a little bit strange there. Still working on that. Next, we have how full the coin vault is in percent, so 25% here. And then finally, just a timestamp of the local time at the payphone when this printout was obtained. So I started dialing some payphones and was noticing that I was getting these printouts. And I thought, this is really interesting. And at the time, I didn't really know of anybody that was calling payphones and getting printouts because, who would do that kind of thing, right? And so I was manually calling these payphones. And eventually, as I started calling all the payphones that I knew about at the time, it began to get kind of tedious, as you can imagine. So I did what all good IT professionals do. I automated it. And my first attempt at automating it was using AutoHotkey, which maybe some of you have used before. And it was an interesting solution. So the way that it worked was that the script would basically open up HyperTerminal. So this was running on a Windows machine. And it would open HyperTerminal, put in the number. It would enable logging, because that was actually a paid feature if you wanted to do that programmatically. But you could do it through the GUI for free. And then it would call the number and record the printout to a log file. And then I would go through later and post-process those. And so this kind of worked. I was able to get printouts this way, but it was rather clunky for a few reasons. One is that because this ran interactively, it actually took over the entire computer while this was running. And at the time, this was actually running on somebody else's computer connected to his POTS line. And so anytime this was running, he couldn't do anything with his computer. And so occasionally that would cause issues. And so I eventually looked to trying to get a better automation solution. And so later I found out about something called Kermit, which was a project maintained by Columbia University at one time for interacting with modems and even other kinds of internet protocols as well. And so this is really nice because it allowed me to script all of this in an automation that could run non-interactively. And so this is currently what I still use, and this has allowed the project to scale much better than AutoHotkey could ever have done. So this is a graph that I put together recently showing the average daily revenue of payphones in the United States. And this is using a sample of 447 phones that I've been able to make contact with. And so the leftmost bar here basically indicates that about 25% of these phones are not making any revenue at all consistently. So that's basically zero. So maybe that's what you'd expect or not. But I think what's more interesting is that means that the remaining 75% of payphones are actually getting used on a regular basis. Some more than others, obviously. So as you can see, this is a heavily skewed distribution. So there's a lot of phones that get a little usage, and then the higher the revenue, the fewer phones that are actually making that amount of revenue. But 3/4 of phones are getting used on a consistent basis. And I believe the figures from PTS on payphone revenue is that it needs to make somewhere just south of $100 a month to remain profitable. So by that metric, most of these payphones are not profitable on their own. And so the way that they'll do that is they will actually charge whoever wanted the payphone there. So maybe it's a business, or maybe it's a public interest phone that a local government is sponsoring or something like that. And they'll have to actually pay for the phone. It used to be more common, and still is in some cases, where if the payphone makes enough money, that the owner of the location will get a commission on that payphone. And so there's still a few phones, as you can see here, that are probably generating some nice commissions for those people, but that is typically not the norm anymore. So one thing you can do if you ever encounter a payphone in the wild is determine what the number of the payphone is. Obviously, this is really useful if you want to try to call the payphone or do other things later. And so the easiest way to do that is if you just call that first number, just dial 4 basically, and that is the MCI ANAC, or Automatic Number Announcement Circuit, and that will just read back the number that you're calling from, which can be helpful if you're at a payphone. Often they will have a number card on the phone itself, but they're not always accurate. So this is a good way to just double check that and make sure that you know what the right number is. The second one there is also another MCI ANAC. That third number is another number that's set up by a fellow PhreakNet member, where it will be able to determine if you're calling from a payphone based on the class of service of the call. And so this is basically a nice way where hopefully we can stay up to date with payphone reports. But you can also email this email address if you happen to encounter a payphone. As the project has expanded, most of the payphones are actually sourced through the community, and I've sort of been aggregating it. So we definitely can't continue to keep finding out about these locations without user contribution. So these are extremely helpful. If you do find a payphone and are able to report it, definitely much appreciated.
So at one point, Naveen and I were sitting down, and we had both heard about this project in Portland, Oregon called PhilTel, where years back this software engineer installed a payphone, made it free to use. He put it right in his front lawn in Portland, and noticed people actually started using it. And it got to the point where he installed a handful more. Years later now, I think they're up to a dozen. They have some as far north as Seattle. I think there's one in Detroit. So they're slowly expanding westward or eastward. But I was talking to Naveen, and I said, what if we just do this same thing ourselves? Because logically, the next step for us is to start a payphone company of some sort, right? So we decided we want to bring payphones back, make them free to use, because sure, they could help out a lot of people and they could benefit a lot of people in the community. But we think payphones are really cool. We think it's something that should be preserved. People should still know what these things are, how they work. There's something lost with them disappearing. We wanted to use as much discarded and secondhand stuff as we can. So if you think about it, these payphones that we're finding are all used. They're not really making new payphones anymore. So this is stuff that's really destined for the landfill if you think about it. We also wanted to use as much off-the-shelf hardware as we could, so nothing proprietary, nothing fancy, and as much open source software as possible. So we realized in doing this, there was going to be a significant upfront cost of about $300. If you're looking for a used payphone these days, It could be anywhere from $150 to $200 if you're going through something like eBay. And then we need a little bit more money for hardware that we're going to be adding on. We'll get into that soon. Recurring cost is not that much at all, though. So we have a centralized server where we're routing all the calls through, and that's running on, I believe, the most inexpensive DigitalOcean droplet you can get. And then there's some fee associated with basically renting the phone number, and then a per minute cost for call time, although that cost is fractions of a cent. So you can really operate something like this continuously for the cost of what would be a couple of cups of coffee every month. So as I said before, this really does benefit people without cell phones. So there's a statistic going around that 97% of people in the US have cell phones. But when you look at the population of Philadelphia, that's still, I think, upwards of 100,000 people just documented through the census that don't have cell phones in the city. And that's not even homeless people, that's not undocumented people. So there's still a big need out there for people to have access to communications that they otherwise wouldn't have. And also it benefits Naveen. Naveen does not have a cell phone. He's got his landline, and if he has a payphone when he goes out, that's what he uses. So he's customer number one. So payphone hardware. So this is actually the first payphone that we worked on. I bought this when I was a teenager for probably about $20, and it sat in my basement until this project. So looking it up, or looking inside of it here, you can see in that middle image on the left side is one of those smart boards that we had been talking about. So this is a COCOT. On the right, you can see a coin collector. At the bottom, you can see a relay. On that image all the way to the right, that's the back of the keypad. And that's where the keypad interfaces, that's where the handset interfaces, the hook switch, all comes in there, and then this couples together to create your phone. So if we look at a much older phone, you can kind of see some similar components here. So obviously the coin slot is a little bit more in the middle, but you still have your collector, you still have a relay at the bottom, you still have some sort of board off to the side, and on the back of the keypad you have a board that interfaces with the keypad, the handset, the hook switch, etc. So I really like to point this out because these phones can all be serviced with a simple flathead screwdriver. They made these to be worked on. They made these to be easily repaired. It was all about speed and making these payphones get back up to operating standard. So they're really fun and pretty easy to work on as a novice, provided you have figured out what everything is, because they just made them so modular and easy to work on. Okay, so I have this COCOT board. So it's a ProTel 7000 series, and I'm looking up how to program this. So with some COCOTs, you can actually program them through the keypad directly. This is not one of those. I basically got the hardest payphone to work on. So you need to install special DOS software. Some people say it needs to be on bare metal. Some people are saying you need a proprietary modem. Some people, it exploded in complexity for what I was trying to do. So I was really searching for ideas for how can I not use this board. I would like to use it at some point, but for right now, I just want something to work. So that's when I came upon this. This is a 2110V coinless board. So these are made for armored phones, also known as prison phones. So it's similar to a payphone in form factor, but there's no coin slot. So think about just like a courtesy phone or something like that that's still armored. So these are almost a good drop-in replacement for payphone smartboards. You do have to change the connectors a little bit, but everything has a one-to-one mapping. And they're no longer made, so they're still available through payphone.com. They have a pretty big inventory, but at some point these are going to be gone, and we're going to need to think of solutions to get past this board onto something else. So here's a picture of the board actually installed. You can see there's a dangling gong ringer under there, so we have a real gong ring. And everybody always asks about the paper towel tube on the left side there. So somebody gave me this funny idea, which is you could donate to our project by putting coins in the coin slot. And I actually don't have the vault in this phone unlocked. It's still locked to this day. Can't get into it. So I thought, let's be able to accept coins, but I don't want anything to short out on this board. So I used the cardboard tube to direct everything just to the bottom of the upper housing. Yeah. So from this, we wanted to figure out how to actually get these phones on some sort of phone network, actually making and taking calls again. So if you were at Whopper or PumpCon last year, you might have seen this interesting rig that I was bringing around. And essentially, this is the world's most complicated cell phone. And we'll drill into that. So the heart of this is a Grandstream HT801 ATA. So this is an analog telephone adapter. And it basically has 2 ports on the back, one for your LAN networking and one for a telephone, a standard analog telephone. So this basically sets up a bridge between the analog phone and the SIP, session initiation protocol, which is the most commonly used voice protocol these days. This is how you get calls over the internet. So this device registers as a client to our telephone exchange that we have in DigitalOcean, so we can make and take calls. And we could really use any ATA for this, but this one is really good because, number one, it's inexpensive, it's easy to find used, and 2, it has free built-in remote management through the provider, or through the vendor. So we can easily monitor things, we can push firmware updates remotely, we don't have to visit sites in person to fix things. So we also have a GL iNet AR300M router. We wanted some sort of way to get these ATAs to use Wi-Fi if we needed to. So this basically works out as a wireless bridge. These are also very inexpensive. They run OpenWRT natively, so anything we need, we can throw that on here. And we use it as a Wi-Fi bridge, but also as an Open VPN client. So we have all of the connection tunneled back to our server, encrypted from the site. And actually, in some deployments, we don't need this. If we have a wired connection, those ATAs, that model specifically happens to support OpenVPN natively. So this could be eliminated from installs, but if we have an older ATA that doesn't support that, or even if we don't get this particular router, anything that runs OpenWRT, we're able to use. So the last part is we had this portable rig running over a hotspot. So these are really inexpensive T-Mobile Franklin T9 hotspots. T-Mobile used to give these away for free, so they're on eBay really cheap. Stock, it works for T-Mobile or any carrier that piggybacks on it, which is a lot of the budget rate carriers. They're really easy to SIM unlock with this one console command you can run. And they're also pretty easy to root, and you can get into a bunch of hidden debug pages and technical pages. You can change all the nitty-gritty details that I fully don't understand, but these are pretty good hackable hotspots in case anybody's in the market for one. So putting it all together, so there's that box there at the bottom, that's our Payphone installation site. So we have the Payphone connected to an ATA, connected to our router, and that's all VPN'd back to the server through an existing ISP modem at the site or cellular. And then from our server over the internet, we contact a VoIP provider that gets us connection to the public switch telephone network. So that's really how we make these phones able to talk with the phone that you have in your pocket.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, we use Asterisk for our communications server. So Asterisk is an open source telephony project commonly used now by a lot of enterprises for PBXs or phone systems. And here we use SIP, as Mike mentioned, both for communication between the ATA, so wherever the phone is located, as well as the Asterisk server. And then we also use SIP to our VoIP provider. SIP is typically the protocol that most of them will use. But Asterisk can do a lot more than just talk SIP. So it actually supports a wide variety of protocols, including more traditional protocols. So if you want to do anything with TDM or traditional telephony, so you can hook up a channel bank or an analog telephony card to your server if you have a PCI slot, and that would be using the DOTI channel driver in this case. So you can definitely do more than just IP telephony. And Asterisk also allows for interesting things like PhreakNet, which is a voice over IP hobbyist telephony network that is essentially set up to try to simulate or recreate the way that the old telephone network in North America worked. So it's essentially trying to be a recreation of that. So it supports old protocols and switching protocols that used to be possible. So if you've ever heard of blue boxing or red boxing, so blue boxing is basically when you would seize a long distance trunk using the 2600 hertz trunk tone to reroute your call to make free calls typically. And red boxing would be spoofing the coin denomination tones in a single slot payphone to make free calls at payphones. So neither of these work on the PSTN today, at least in North America. But you can still do these on PhreakNet and phreak away as much as you want without fear of legal repercussions. There's also some nice things tied into it, like this mock billing system. So whenever toll calls are made on the network, they're basically ticketed, and at the end of the month, everyone receives a bill showing them how much their calls would have cost if they were made in 1977, based on the actual distance and time between the participants. And sometimes this is really eye-opening to people, just how much long distance used to cost back in the day. So it's kind of nice to get that effect without actually having to pay this bill ourselves.
So we got our first payphone ready, and we're able to install it in December 17th of 2022 at Iffy Books, which is a local bookstore in the area. So we had a party, a bunch of hackers and phreakers showed up. Everybody was having a great time. People were blue boxing the phone. People were making prank phone calls to their friends. It was pretty much in use the whole night. So a couple weeks later, we actually had to reinstall the phone because Iffy Books moved within the same building, and we're going to have to move it again soon because just this week they moved to Rittenhouse Square. So we're going to have to do another move, and we might even have another installation party. I'll have to talk to Steve, the owner, about it. But yeah, it was pretty well received. The community seemed to enjoy it. There was, I think, 40-some people that turned out, which was more than I was expecting, and everybody had a lot of fun. So something really weird is that somehow the news or the media got a hold of this story, and so I was getting contacted by the Inquirer, the Washington Post, CNN, NPR, like national news. Like, it's really weird to get cold called by NPR. Like, it's wakes you up in the morning. But it really showed that there was some interest in what we were doing. And I know you're never supposed to read the comments, but I did read some of the comments, and there was tons of people with really positive things to say. So I was really happy that this wasn't only just cool to us and maybe, you know, a local group of people, but it had sort of a national impact, and people really seemed to enjoy it. So moving on to the future, we're definitely working on more installations. We only have the one phone installed. It's been a little slow going. So you can see at this map, the center pin is the currently installed phone. You can make out the blue pins. Those are locations that have contacted us saying, hey, when you're ready, we want a phone here. And then there's a purple color pin, which are areas that people have proposed to us saying, this place, they probably want a payphone, they just don't know it yet. So there seems to be a lot of interest, and it's really cool to see that depending on where we do installations, it can spread throughout the city. So it's not just all concentrated in one area. We can get some pretty good coverage. So we have a new phone in the works currently for Thunderbird Salvage over on Frankfurt Ave in the East Kensington area. So we've been working with the shop owner there, as well as a local hacker who has been very helpful in this whole process, facilitating this relationship. And he also donated last week a new old stock payphone with an electromechanical brass ringer that will be perfect for this installation. And what's really cool is that the salvage store has a red British phone box that they're going to install at the front of their building, and we're going to put a phone in it that actually works. So we're really excited about this. We have the location lined up. We have the phone ready. And our next step is sort of fundraising. So Naveen and I are basically funding this out of pocket and also on donations. So we've had some people donate money, but also other things. We've had people donate those payphones that are sitting around in their garage that they haven't done anything with in 10 years. We've had people donate outdoor rated Cat 3 cable, which is awesome. That'll help a lot. So there are tons of ways that other people can contribute to this project. And aside from physical stuff, speaking about donations, we were going to get this free COCOT programming line operational. So I mentioned before how I had this ProTel 7000 board. It needed something that could run DOS software. It might need a proprietary modem. So that picture at the top left, that's a thin client running Windows 98, which supports DOS software. Those are proprietary modems from this vendor. The middle-ish picture, we both now have channel bank hardware so that it's closer to an actual phone line as opposed to SIP. We should have all the right tools now to be able to program these old boards that we have, as well as open this up publicly. So anybody with an old Payphone smartboard can call into our service free of charge from their house and program their Payphone remotely. But we've also had people donating various bits of hardware. So that circuit board there was donated by a friend. That's for an Earnest Telecom Payphone, which is a weird brand. But we were able to dump all the ROMs on this board. So somebody out there might have one of these boards. The ROMs have rotted away. We have the ROM saved. Bottom left corner, I bought a bunch of ProTel software from eBay. We had a friend who's a pretty prolific floppy archivist and software cracker image these boards on a patio out with running on battery power, and was able to, in 15 minutes, back these up and put them on archive.org. So there's really something cool with this whole living museum aspect of this, where we are getting all this hardware, we're getting this software, and we're trying to make it easy for other people to use, but make it available. We don't want this rotting away or just sitting in somebody's basement. We want to make this usable and allow people to interact with it. And that's it. So I don't know if we have time for questions, do we? Or should we? Yeah. Do we have time for questions? Yeah, we can take some questions if anybody's.
So for example, PhilTel, which is trying to be,
VoIP-based?
the one that's like trying to be national is a phone system.
PhreakNet.
So that's voice SIP.
So you can, yeah.
Yeah, so the way that it works,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's my question. The setup is
Yeah, so you're asking about FreakNet, I'm assuming?
PhreaKnet. It's voice SIP. Can you run modems over that?
Okay, so the question was referring to FreakNet, the hobbyist network we talked about. Can you run modems over it, and how does it work? So the way that it works is it's actually essentially a bunch of different asterisk systems at either members' houses or maybe in a data center or something like that. They might have their own phones or some kind of electromechanical switch connected to it. Those can use whatever protocols they want locally. Between the asterisk systems themselves, we use the inter-asterisk exchange protocol, also known as EEX. So this is a very niche voice over IP protocol. It's basically exclusively used between asterisk systems. But it works really well for that. It's very efficient, works much better than SIP for that purpose. As far as modems, we've had some success in getting modems to work over it, but it tends to vary a lot depending on the quality of internet connections. Like just a few weeks ago, I dialed up to an ISP in California over VoIP, and I got 50.6K. So, I mean, it didn't last super long, but it handshook and everything. So it can be a challenge. There are some projects out there, actually, where they're using GPS clocks to improve the synchronization on both ends to make modems more reliable over voice over IP. And I've heard that they've had a lot of luck with that as well.
Yeah, so the question is, payphones are cool, I want one, they're kind of expensive, how can I get one without driving the price up for everybody else? I think that sort of sums it up. I mean, I don't have too good of an answer for you. I know that, so with the pandemic, the prices for everything secondhand electronic have gone up dramatically. Like it's wild to see, these payphones used to go for $50 or so, and now it's tripled or quadrupled in price. One thing I've seen with Craigslist is that the listings usually go fast. So again, we are all competing for this stuff, but every once in a while you will have these people who have like 20 or 30 of them and list it in a big lot. And it usually is the situation where they say, you know, I want $100 each, and then you show up and you say, I want 5 of them, and then they give you a good deal. So I don't think there's really any way, like the stock in the world of payphones is dwindling every year. Like every year more get thrown away. So it's becoming a scarcity. So there's probably not a really good way to make it so that everybody gets a payphone and we keep the prices low. But at least you could try to target these people who have a ton of them, who are just going to sell them flat rate individually, and try to work with one of them. But I'm sure if you buy from a guy just selling one off, it's not going to make the market go crazy or anything. It's already as crazy as it can be. All right. Anybody else? No? All right. I think we're done.
Thank you. All right. Oh, it's lunchtime. Sorry, I get your name wrong. Naveen. Yes, I thought it was Naveen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Great
much.
talk. Thank you.
Don't forget your charger. I know. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
I was going to ask, can I have a photo with you guys?
Sure.
And then the best slides on the screen if
Oh,
possible.
I can do that, yeah.
Let me spread the word.
Yeah. What do you think the best slide is?
The one has the payphone. Yeah.
There's so many with pay. There's this one. Do you want one of like the beginning ones?
Yeah. Which one do you think is funniest?
I mean, this one's pretty good.
Yeah.
You like this one?
Yeah.
You are cool.
I haven't been in this.
You want to picture us with this?
Yeah. Like have a selfie together.
Yeah, hopefully, I think Mike's trying to go too.
I want to go. Yeah. Yeah, we've been talking to some other people that also want to go. So we're gonna see how many people.
Like the old CNET network
Yes.
that, everybody's on too. Yeah, it's awesome. And it's a good show, and there's a ton of intelligence out there. And then they do like barn hopping. It's like these guys will liquidate these like old data centers and rip everything out of it and set it up in their barns, like all fully functional. Like they could run the whole region off of the crap in their barns.
Yeah.
It's pretty slick.
Yeah, John and Paul have some pretty nice setups there.
Yeah, John Jones?
Yeah.
Yeah. He works for Siemens. He's pretty he's through his channel.
Yeah. He's a wealth of knowledge for sure.
Yeah. It's good. Well, good to meet you, Greg.
Yeah.
All right, I'll see you in Lancaster.
CNET member. Yeah. Hopefully we'll see you there.
All right, sounds good. Thanks. Hey, you too. Thanks, guys.
Quick photos and